Blood Herring by E.H. Drake. Read for you by Dallin and Kennedy Bradford. Dedication. To Uncle Bear, who sat up with me several nights to keep me company while I wrote, and watched many a cheesy vampire movie with me. We miss you. Chapter 1. Gabe. Paperwork. All the technological advances, and they were still burying me in paperwork. Each of my knuckles ached from the typing. I leaned away from the faux wood desk and pushed my hands through my hair. Off to my right, Sanders tried to coerce a witness into coming back. Sadly, none of this served to distract me from the case at hand. This much typing should be considered cruel and unusual punishment. In reality, I just wanted to avoid the rest of my report. I joined this department to help people, yet people were my biggest problem. Another case where humans were the perpetrator. Sadly, the stale ceiling tiles didn't offer any condolences, no matter how long I stared. "Yo, Collins!" The shrill whistle of my partner made me jump from my chair. "Jesus, Harper, you trying to get my attention or call back some hunting hounds?" James Harper sat on my desk, holding a small stack of papers in one broad hand. His dark head shone in the bullpen's fluorescent light, and pale flakes of Pop-Tart crumbs littered his bushy beard. "Sorry to scar you for life, buddy, but the captain just handed us a fresh one." I groaned and eyed the already swelling inbox on my desktop. My hands are cramped just thinking about the reports I gotta file tonight. Harper smiled, shifting his big brows and burly beard, and spilling some of his breakfast onto my desk. "If only you had a partner to help with all those, eh?" I stood, reaching across my desk to brush the pastry crumbs away. "Yeah, and one that could groom himself." My partner realized the mess he'd made and moved his big frame like something had bitten him. "Oh, shit, sorry, man." He dusted off the few crumbs I'd missed. "Don't sweat it. Not many could brag about surviving the dreaded crumb attack." I shrugged as I finished flicking the last bits away. Harper barked a single laugh. My lips twisted up at the corners. "So, what's my next report?" "Uniforms were responding to calls out in Rockwood when they found a body," he said simply. My eyebrows knitted together. That's not exactly uncommon for the area. What makes it one of ours? Violence, drugs, working girls, all of these were fairly normal for Rockwood, and we hardly got calls from the residents. We'd once had a woman who'd rammed her car into her boyfriend's truck repeatedly. The next day, he'd dropped the charges, and I caught them making out in our lobby. Very classy place. Harper handed me the stack of papers. "Read the calls." I took the pages and began flipping through them. The skin between my brows pinched as I read the first anonymous 911 call. Well then. "Keep going." I read on, practically shoving my nose through the paper. 3 different calls over 4 days, but all the same? "Yep." Harper smacked his lips on the P for emphasis. "And I guess the condition of the body was pretty gnarled." I grimaced at the mental picture and handed them back to him. "Okay, let's go see if this is another fake." 20 minutes later, we were driving through Rockwood, and I was waiting for the twang of noir music to start. Or maybe my eyesight would slowly drift to grayscale as we descended into poverty. The bright yellow dandelions escaping through cracks in the sidewalk begged to differ, as did the expensive cars mixed among cheap lawn ornaments. My breath turned into an exasperated sigh. Harper flicked his gaze to me. "Something on your mind, partner?" I debated letting out a good rant. The politics here made it so people had a hard time getting out. But then I would end up talking about the same people refusing to call the cops because many were criminals themselves. After that, I'd descend into rambling about the poor innocent kids who were quickly being taught that crime was the only way to survive, and the endless revolving door of bad priorities and horrendous politics. It would have been nice to blow off steam, but Harper had heard it all before. I decided to switch topics. Nah, just thinking of the forms you left on my desk. Harper let out one of his harsh laughs. Hey, I bought coffee. Doesn't that earn me some kind of break? Harper turned down Lincoln Avenue and eased off the gas. Fast enough to move smoothly with traffic, but slow enough that we could watch for anything worth reacting to. A single cup isn't going to cut it this time. At this rate, you might as well buy me a new machine. Maybe one of them fancy ones with a timer. The distraction was nice, even if it was temporary. Oh, and while I'm at it, I suppose you'd like it to be a fancy latte thing with something for your... Aw, man! Harper pulled over and groaned. A crowd had already gathered, some dancing on the asphalt in their pajamas or slippers, and even a few wearing house robes I prayed didn't fall open. This day was ugly enough as is. At least the news isn't here. I tried to give Harper a sympathetic look. Neither of us really cared for audiences. Yet, he grumbled as he climbed out of the car. You take the scene and Emmy. I got out and scowled over the roof of the car. You're just trying to unload more work on me. Nah, I want to talk to the uniforms, see what they got. Harper walked off, politely elbowing his way past the onlookers and hailing one of the uniforms by name. Hey, Johnson! I pulled a similar, though less successful routine, trying to smile my way through the crowd. Pretty sure someone called me a cracker, but it wasn't worth addressing. Instead, I rolled my eyes and ducked under the crime scene tape. It gave a soft twang as I let it fall back in place behind me and nodded at the nearest uniforms. Hey, Stevens, how's the missus? She's taken a liking to ghost pepper pickles. He shivered in exaggerated disgust and waved me in. How's Michelle? I shrugged. No need to talk about that here. The garish light of the ME van and a couple of cruisers tried to compete with the sun in thick red and blue waves. The body was partially shielded under a red splotched shroud as a stubby little man examined it. It didn't stop the putrid smell of death from wafting my way. What do we got, Dan? I pulled a small notebook from one pocket, yanking the pen from the spine. I'm afraid it's the real deal, the medical examiner greeted me, in kind. You sure it's not a fake, like last month? Certain. The tail ends of his huge mustache danced under his mask like a couple of deranged squirrels, while the tubby old man looked at me through his round spectacles. He pulled the shroud back and pointed at our victim's neck. Though the shoulder wound is huge, there are 4 distinct drag marks from the fangs. That's almost impossible to fake. Plus, this bite is the wrong shape for most animals. It was hard to keep my face neutral for the crowd. No matter how many times you see a dead body, it's always horrible. The poor kid couldn't have been more than 20, was all black and purple like he'd been beaten before he'd been killed. His skin was stretched too tight over his face, like he'd tried to scream in his last minutes, but just couldn't. Scenes of past victims swarmed my mind, trying to claim my attention. A girl missing an arm. A man being pulled at like a dog toy between 2 vamps before being torn apart. A mound of human pieces too mangled for me to identify. I closed my eyes and breathed, forcing my brain back into the present. See, right here, Dan pointed to twin drag marks, the kid's neck sliced into big ribbons just before a softball-sized hole sank into the flesh. Blood had gushed in a reddish-brown torrent, making a nauseating congealed puddle on the blacktop. Damn, Harper's not gonna like this. And you do? Dan eyed me as he covered the kid back up. It wasn't like I was thrilled it was a murder, but having an actual vampire case That was exactly what I'd joined this team for. Not hunt down husbands who'd killed their wives with a damn deli fork. But the bloodsuckers hid their dirty business well, and I was stuck with a pile of human posers. I sidestepped the question. Any ID? That was handled by uniforms. Nice way of saying, not my problem. I took additional notes and shoved the pad back in my pocket. All right. Thanks, Dan. Dan looked back to the victim. Wish I could say it was a pleasure to see you. I shrugged. Come beat Harper at poker next time we get together. Maybe you'll finally have a chance. Dan shook his head. No offense, Collins, but I think I'll pass on hearing shop talk after hours. See you next time, Dan. He wished me well as I left. It took a minute to tiptoe back around the crime scene techs and the tiny yellow markers to make my way back to my partner. He was waiting for me inside the tape. Harper blew out an exasperated sigh and combed his beard with his hands as I gave him the news. Man, I was really hoping it was just another dog bite. Hey, at least now we know those 911 calls weren't fakes. Always looking on the bright side, eh, partner? Harper probably would have done all the paperwork from now on if I offered to go solo on this one case. But I needed him with me on this one. God knew what I'd find working a real case. We had to expect something bad when multiple people claim folks are disappearing right off the street. It had only been 2 years, but in that short time, a lot of murderers had tried to fake vampire crimes to get away with it. God knows how many had succeeded, especially during the original panic. It took months for police departments to train their officers and medical examiners to properly sort the twisted fakes from the real deal. Sadly, most of my calls were for human-on-human murders. Well, Johnson, Harper pointed to the uniform in question, says they didn't find any ID, and most people were pretty hush-hush when they canvassed the neighborhood. Shocking. Yeah, but a few were a bit more adamant than others. They thought we should try those. Want to see if detective puts the fear of God into them? I lifted the crime scene tape to allow my partner through. As it fell back in place, local news pulled up, the brakes barely applied before 2 men rushed towards the scene, giddy at their early arrival. Yeah, gotta start somewhere. Harper scowled at the newcomers. Wonder why they left the body out in public. They usually seem to clean up after a meal. Sad but true. We rarely found vampire victims just lying around. That was kind of the problem. Vampires might eat like rabid animals, but they were smart. They knew how to cover themselves. Probably from centuries of practice. Though that was just speculation. The last time we found actual vampire victims, it had been a pile of working girls located during a drug bust. Their arms had been littered with track and fang marks alike, their pale and bloated bodies piled in a room for later disposal. That scene still clung to my dreams. The fact that we still hadn't brought in the ones responsible didn't help. I don't know. Maybe we got lucky and it's a young one. We walked up the street to the first of many houses. Yeah, I feel real lucky right now. Harper rang the first doorbell. 6 slammed doors, a crazy old cat lady, a hoarder, and 1 house of screaming children later, Harper and I sat next to each other on a rather clean, floral couch, sipping tea. We both thought tea was a bit too frilly, unless you counted the sweet, iced kind. However, we'd both learned a long time ago that if someone let you in, and you turned down their drink offers, they'd spend all their time asking repeatedly if you were sure instead of focusing on your questions. People's manners could be a damn nuisance. So, begrudgingly, we both tried to smile and sip from our frail cups. Ah, excellent, Miss Stafford. Thank you. Why, thank you, dear. The old lady's brown cheeks lifted in a smile. The tone complemented nicely the gray bun on the back of her head. Now, what did you boys want to ask about? Harper sipped again before starting. Well, ma'am, we've received a few calls about unusual violence in this area. I imagine you already know that's not unusual round here. There wasn't any shake in Angela Stafford's voice, but it had lost its sweetness. It's one of the reasons I don't invite my children down here more often. When I was a little kid, I'd thought of detectives as real-life superheroes. They could crack any bad guy like magic. But then I grew up, joined the force, and started getting into the routine of interrogations. We don't have any superpowers, but the best detectives are damn good lie detectors. It could be as simple as a rushed word or a quick bite of the lower lip, but it didn't take much to set off our inner polygraph. Something about this woman, how she talked about her kids, set the little bulb in my head off, bright red and on alert. Yes, we do. However, these reports were a bit more specific. I took another swig as I spoke. We're part of the Vampire Police Bureau. Miss Stafford's eyes darkened. She set her cup down on a doily covering the coffee table between us. What are the vamp cops doing here? The VPB got word that there were a lot of disappearances at night with no traces. Harper put his cup down. It was well over half full. And I don't know if you noticed all the commotion down the street. Afraid I didn't. I tend to keep to my own here. I'm sure you understand. Little old thing like me in this area. I do best if I'm ignored altogether. At her age, you only lived in this area because your budget wouldn't allow for anything else. Yet when uniforms had come by, nobody had answered. The bulb in my head blazed brighter, but I kept quiet all the same, not wanting to upset the flow Harper had set. I'm afraid a body was discovered. Harper paused, trying to let that sink in. We don't have a name, but the time of death was sometime last night. You mean to tell me a corpse done showed up in the middle of our street and y'all just now found it? She looked mildly displeased by that, yet the volume of her voice didn't raise. It was a few hours ago, ma'am, Harper continued. She let out a humph and sat back. I suppose you can't watch this area 24/7. She picked her saucer back up and began sipping idly. I'm really not sure how I could help. Like I said, I mind myself. And we respect that, of course. I tried to sound reassuring. We understand life in this area requires special precautions. She eyed me and Harper over her cup, pausing on each of us, then nodded. What do you boys want to know? Did you hear anything? Maybe around 9 or 10 last night? Harper took the reins again. I hear plenty every night. Guns blazing, little hoodlums yammering on at all hours. Just last night there was some hollering over there. She placed her cup back on the saucer and waved her weathered hand in the general direction of where we'd found the body. Course, one could hardly call that out of the ordinary. Harper and I nodded. He tried to prompt her further. Any specifics stick out, even just single words or names? There was a lot of cursing, yelling. I had to turn up Family Feud just to drown it out. She tilted her head and squinted her dark eyes at a distant point behind us. I don't think I've heard that much cursing in my life. I'd abandoned my teacup, making quick notes as Harper kept the questions going. Any other details aside from the foul language? Miss Stafford pursed her lips and twisted her brows, trying to replay something in her mind as she spoke slowly. Well, they hollered on about soda at some point. Harper wrinkled his nose and I stopped writing. Soda? Yeah, before I finally gave up and cranked up the volume, I heard one yell something about cherry coke. Thought that was weird. Harper and I looked at each other. He looked as bewildered as I felt. We stood in silent agreement. Well, Miss Stafford, I think that's all. But if you think of anything else, let me leave you my card. Nah, just write your number down. Best guess she didn't want to have a detective's card sitting around where her neighbors might see it. I obliged, tearing a page from my notebook and handing it to her on our way out. As we turned back to her on the stoop, I spoke loud enough for any eavesdropping neighbors. "Thanks again for the tea. Be sure to let us know if you do see anything." She smiled. "So sorry I couldn't help, but thanks for giving an old bird some company, boys." With that, she shut the door. Harper and I shared a knowing look and walked away. We waited until we were back on the sidewalk to talk. Harper's dark eyes shifted back towards the old lady's window as he spoke. "Seem odd to you?" "Yeah." I kept my eyes on the gray slab underfoot. She didn't hear our ambulance arrive, or a bunch of people talking over each other. But that old crone picked up on that argument, no problem. You've been listening to a sample of Blood Herring by E.H. Drake. For the complete story, pick up your copy at Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or wherever you get your books. Audiobook, read for you by Dallin and Kennedy Bradford, coming soon.